a very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to the ICANN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. So, at the outset, I wanted to tell you that because the prelims have now been postponed, don't relax and sit back and waste your time. Rather, divide your time in the day between both prelims as well as give some time for mains and answer writing and content development so that you don't have to struggle with the mains preparation after the prelims gets over. So, divide your time wisely and make the most of this time. So, with this, we will start with personality of the day. Today, we'll be talking about Air Marshal Padmavati Bandyopadhyay. So, what is special about her? She is the first woman Air Marshal of the Indian Air Force. And she has also participated in the Indo-Pakistan War of 1971. She has also served during the Kargil War. She was the first Indian woman to have conducted scientific research at the North Pole. And she is the first woman to be promoted to the Vice Air Marshal. And she is an aviation medicine specialist. So there are so many firsts about her. And this shows that for women, sky is the only limit. So she can aspire to become anything, she can dream to become anything, and it is possible with a lot of determination and grit to achieve that goal. So even in those areas which have hitherto been confined for only the men, it is possible for women to leave their mark and also excel in those fields. So this story shows that it's a story about women empowerment and that women can aspire for really big dreams and they can also achieve the same. So this can be used in essays on women empowerment, even in Indian society paper, that is GS1 paper on Indian society about the traditional role of women, about women empowerment. This example can be used. So first topic of the day is about the Food Corporation of India. The article in the newspaper analyzed what had been its role and what is its relevance at the present point of time, and also it discussed a few issues about the Food Corporation of India and the way we can revamp it. So let's get to the basics first. The Food Corporation of India was set up under the Food Corporation Act of 1964. So this is a statutory body, and the syllabus itself says about constitutional, statutory, regulatory bodies. So this can come as a question like critically analyze the role of Food Corporation of India in contributing to the food security. So there you have this topic becomes very relevant. So it's a statutory body established under the Food Corporation Act of 1964. And we also know that this body was at the forefront of India's quest of self-sufficiency in rice and wheat, and during the Green Revolution period it was at the forefront. And it also supported our public distribution system, wherein the Food Corporation of India procures its stocks and also distributes. So basically when we talk about the Food Corporation of India, its working can be divided into three phases. So the first phase we're going to talk about is the 1960s, where it helped in the Green Revolution, and it supported the PDS system through procurement, stockpiling, distribution of the food grains through the fair price shops. The second phase was in the 1970s and the 1980s. So during this period, it was observed that the Food Corporation of India is facing several issues. For instance, the operations aspect of the FCI, it was found that its operations were very expensive. Like procuring was expensive, stocking, distributing, everything became very expensive. It was not cost effective, so it was very inefficient. There was poor storage conditions, because of which there was a lot of grain loss because of pests, mostly due to rats. There was also a widespread leakage of the grains or corruption, and FCI was also used to in this period of time have huge stockpiles. Even when we were studying about the COVID crisis, we saw that at current time the FCI has a stockpile of 77 million tons of food grains, and FCI does not have a proactive liquidation policy to sell off these excess stocks in the market. So this excess stockpiling is again another issue. Also, FCI had a very huge debt. So it has a debt of nearly 2.55 lakh crore as on March 2020. So there is a huge debt of FCI. This again is shows the inefficient functioning of the FCI. Similarly, the entire process which involves the procurement of the food grains, this is restricted to just rice and wheat. So because of this, it led to a skewed cropping pattern where rice became a very important crop to be grown in Punjab, Haryana, where the climate doesn't suit. So this has led to the exploitation of underground groundwater and also salinity in the soils because of irrigation. So all of these problems and skewed cropping pattern is the result of FCI's policy to procure just rice and wheat. So these were the period of inefficiencies, and then in the 1990s, the Food Corporation of India was in fact called as the food corruption of India because of a lot of corruption and leakages in the food grains. So now you can call it the current status. So this also we know, this is what has been now explained, that you can talk about the debts which is there, and you can talk about the huge stockpiles which is there, and again everything related to the phases, right from procurement to stockpiling to distribution. This whole life cycle, there are issues even at the current stage. So you can explain the issues in the form of a timeline and divide it and then code the issues which were there. So this was the evolution of the FCI in 3 phases. So now we'll talk about the relevance. So we are at this current stage now, but then in spite of having these issues, why is it important for us to have FCI now? So FCI is basically involved with procuring the food grains. So we already have an agrarian crisis in India. So as long as this crisis is there, as long as the farmers are producing the produce and they don't have good marketing infrastructure and opportunities, free flow of information, it is very important that there is FCI which can at least procure the food grains produced by the farmers. And again we have the problem of hunger, we have the problem of starvation, and even during the COVID crisis we see the plight of the migrant laborers and workers, the poor, urban poor, the rural poor. So we know that there are a lot of people who can't afford food. So when we are talking about the food security in general, the situation is still bad in India. You can quote statistics to support this and then hence tell that FCI is even today relevant because these problems which because of which the FCI was started are still relevant, if not worse, in today's scenario. So that is why FCI will continue to be relevant. So in this you can see how there is bad storage because we do not have a scientific storage mechanism for the storage of grains. So rats and other pests feed on the grains. So that is how lots of millions of tons of grains get wasted in the storage. That is one thing. And second thing, this came out of a CAG performance audit. So it shows that for most of the times, the food grains that are there that have been procured by the FCI are far more than the FCI's storage capacity. So these top numbers are these food grains procured by FCI, and these are the numbers which indicate the storage capacity of FCI. So more often than not, the food grains procured by the FCI is always more than the storage capacity. So that is why it has led to such bad storage. And this shows the entire process of the procurement. So there is a farmer, and the farmer gets a minimum support price, and his produce is procured by the Food Corporation of India. Then the Food Corporation of India will store in its godowns, and then it will give it to the state governments when the state governments provide the FCI with the central issue price. Then the state governments will undertake distribution to the fair price shops. From the fair price shops, it reaches the beneficiary. So it's like the farmer is close to the state governments, but still FCI is procuring and then giving it to the state governments. This shows the centralized nature of procurement, but several experts have been arguing for a decentralized procurement scheme so as to remove the inefficiencies with respect to the centralized procurement scheme of FCI. Because this involves a lot of costs, whether it is storage or transportation and all that. Rather, farmer being more close to the state governments, the produce can be stored at the state level itself. So then what is the solution? the article also discussed several solutions. The first thing is that the FCI should cooperate with the National Agriculture Cooperative and Marketing Federation of India. So National Agriculture Cooperative Marketing Federation of India, FCI, should cooperate with it so that the expertise to manage the logistics can be exchanged, and they can coherently work together to manage the whole thing better. Secondly, there has to be decentralized pre-positioning. Pre-positioning means what? This happens in the United States, where the food grains are pre-positioned at a local level, which could be called as hunger hotspots. So the food grains are pre-positioned in these hunger hotspots, so that whenever there is a crisis and there is a need for grains, people do not panic, and readily food grains are available to them. There is no starvation. So there has to be a decentralized pre-positioning at the local level itself, so that in types of crisis there is no starvation. So these pre-positioning can be there in the hunger hotspots. The third thing is, at present the FCI is following the first in first out method. That is, the grain which is procured the earliest should be the grain that goes out first. But this needs to be changed, so that it enables the movement should be such that the costs will be less, the time involved will be less, the money and effort involved will be less. That should be the strategy, rather than just following a uniform strategy of FIFO, which might involve more costs and more time. The fourth solution offered is that FCI should expand its role. Now it is just engaged in procuring the rice and wheat. So FCI should consider expanding its role, and it can even support the farmer producer organizations, and FCI can procure several commodities. For example, it can procure seeds, it can procure fertilizers, it can procure packaging material. So all of these can be procured by collaborating with FPOs, and then they can be distributed to the needy farmers. So this expansion in the role of FCI is also needed. The next recommendation is, there was a committee in 2015 that was headed by Shanta Kumar. So the Shanta Kumar committee recommends that we need to repurpose the Food Corporation of India. So it should not be just an agency for procuring, storing and distributing the food grains. Rather, it should be an agency for innovation in food management system. So it should better shed its role as procurer and distributor, but rather it should be an innovator in the food management system. So this should be the new role of FCI. And sixth is, we must also modernize our storage infrastructure, because that is very in a bad condition now, and because of which a lot of millions of tons of grains are getting wasted. So these are some of the solutions. Next, we'll see some of the recommendations of the Shanta Kumar committee. So in this, the first thing is, as I was explaining in that flow chart, that the whole process is extremely centralized. From the farmer it goes to FCI, and then it comes to the states, and then it goes to again the local level. So therefore, rather what should happen is, the FCI should concede its role in grain procurement, storage and transportation to the suitable state governments, to the state government agencies. For example, there will be central warehousing, there will be state warehouses, there will be other private sector godowns are there. So FCI can delegate its role in grain procurement, storage and transportation to these state level agencies. So that is very important. So this decentralization in its role is very important to make its operations more cost effective. Second is, there are few backward states like Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, where if the FCI doesn't procure the grains timely, then these farmers will resort to distress sale. Because of the distress sale, they will even sell their produce at bare minimum price, because of which there will be a lot of agrarian crisis and farmers might commit suicide. Because of this, in order to tackle this, what FCI should do is, it should just restrict its procurement operations to these poor backward states like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, where farmers can resort to distress sale. But it should exit from those states which are already doing well. For example, Punjab, Haryana, where the state agencies are themselves well equipped to do this job. So it has to restrict its procurement role to backward states like Bihar, UP, and it has to stop and exit its role in well-performing states. And then also there has to be what are called as negotiable warehouse receipts. So negotiable warehouse receipts means there will be warehouses where the farmers can deposit the produce in these registered warehouses and get at least 80% of the advance from the bank against the produce on the basis of MSP. That means the farmer can deposit his food grains, and whatever MSP, if he has to get say 100 as the MSP for what the grains that he has deposited at the warehouse, he must be able to go to bank and get 80 rupees as advance, because he has already put his produce in the, he has already stored his produce in this registered warehouse. So there has to be this negotiable warehouse receipts. So that concept was also recommended by the Shantakumar committee. And the next thing that the Shantakumar committee recommended was that the FCI has now the stock is overflowing, so therefore there has to be a clear and transparent liquidation policy for the FCI, so that it must be given more flexibility in doing business. So it must be able to offload the surplus stock in the open market, or it must have the flexibility to export it as per the need, but there must not be overflowing stocks. So this was the recommendation. Shantakumar committee also recommended that there must be containers which must be used for storing of the grains rather than just gunny bags, and instead of manual labor lifting the food grains, we must have the forklifts which must do this. And FCI relies mostly on railways to transport the food grains. Rather, we must also make use of inland waterways, which is more cost effective. And also FCI is again another bloated organization, so we must have VRS scheme to the permanent staff so as to shed too much of manpower there. There also has to be end-to-end computerization. So these are all some of the recommendations which were given by the Shantakumar committee, and these can be quoted in the answers whenever there is a question on suggested reforms that can be taken to reform the FCI and the food security system in India. So next we come to the before that I also wanted to tell you that we have in detail covered about food security in even in our previous videos. For example, on 8th April we have covered the impact of COVID on food security and agriculture, and on 11th April we have in detail discussed the question on what is food security, what is its importance, and what steps have been taken in India. So all of these things, and even regarding PDS, on 21st April we have in detail discussed a question on PDS versus direct benefit transfer, and even on 24th April we have discussed example of corruption in PDS on even 20th April. So you can see these videos so as to have a complete coverage of this topic. So now let's go to the MPLAD scheme. MPLAD scheme again has already been covered on 10th April in detail about what is the scheme, when was it brought about, what are the main features of the scheme, and its critical analysis, what is its merits, what are its demerits, and then what should be done in the future. So a detailed coverage of the MPLAD scheme has already been done on 10th April. What we will be seeing today are some CAG findings that were mentioned in today's article. So CAG has done an audit of the MPLAD scheme in which several findings were made. So we will study these findings today, which can be written in the answers to support your arguments. For example, in 78% of the cases, the work recommended were simply an improvement of the existing assets, but it was not recommendation of any new work. So it was just improvement of the existing assets rather than proposing any new work. In 137 cases, it was found that there was a wide variation in what quantities were executed, but what quantities were actually specified. So what was specified and what actually happened, there was wide variations in 137 cases. The CAG audit also found that the work that is being done is of substandard quality. It doesn't match the quality standards, and also the correct procedure is also not followed in several cases. So procedurally also it was found lacking. And also there is a rule under the scheme which says that whatever assets are created, they have to be registered. so that tomorrow somebody can verify the existence and the location of these assets. But such a register was not maintained, so the CAG failed to determine and ascertain if the claimed asset actually existed or not. So this register was also not maintained. And when we talk about the 16th Lok Sabha, nearly 298 out of the 542 members, they didn't spend even a rupee from the 5 crore till the end of 1 year. So only 35 MPs had of the Lok Sabha had utilized their entire amount, and 298 members did not even spend a single rupee. And also the CAG found that for doing these works, the work is given to a contractor, but in many cases this contractor was a relative or a close friend or a confidant of the MP. So this was also another issue. Then the CAG also found that there was misuse of funds. Misuse of funds means what? For example, there was a construction of a fountain in a Juggi Jopdi colony, which means an unauthorized settlement. And in that particular colony, there was no drinking water also. So in such an area, a construction of a fountain was done. So this shows how the money is being misused to construct these waste assets. So that is also another issue. And these were the important findings of the CAG, and this can be quoted in support of the arguments that you offer that this whole scheme has to be discontinued. Now we'll to the next topic, which is the Kaveri Water Management Authority. So now why this is in news is because the government has brought the administrative control of the Kaveri Water Management Authority under the Ministry of Jal Shakti. But this has led to opposition from several states that bringing the CWMA again under the Union Minister of Jal Shakti is going to make CWMA just a puppet of the center. It is going to reduce its autonomy and dilute its independence. So and another issue is that even after 2 years of the formation of CWMA, it does not even have a full-fledged chairman till date. And now this move to bring it under the Ministry of Jal Shakti is going to dilute its independence and autonomy. So this is the concern of the state governments. So this shows the timeline of the Kaveri water dispute. There were 2 agreements that were signed between the princely state of Mysore and the Madras presidency. The first agreement was in 1892 and the second agreement was in 1924. So these 2 agreements dealt with how the water should be used between the Madras presidency and the princely state of Mysore. And there was also these agreements also did deal with the construction of storage and reservoirs on the rivers should be such that it doesn't hurt the lower riparian states. So there were agreements regarding that, but after independence the Karnataka government said that because these agreements were made before independence, so they don't hold any validity. So finally there was the dispute that went on, and in 1990 Supreme Court directed the center to constitute a Kaveri Water Dispute Tribunal, and the tribunal after 17 years it gave its final award. And so in the final award it had told that this should be the allocation. The final award was given in 2007, according to which 419,000 million cubic feet of water was given to Tamil Nadu, 270 to Karnataka, 30 to Kerala and 7 to Puducherry. So then again the states they felt that they did not get their due, so they went again to Supreme Court on a special leave petition, and they said another verdict was given by the Supreme Court in 2018, and in that the Supreme Court modified it to the new numbers where Tamil Nadu's share was reduced and Karnataka's share was increased. And more share was given to Bangalore, and the Supreme Court told that there are drinking water issues in Bangalore and that should any day take precedence over the other issues. So this was one reason. And now we will see what is the role of Kaveri Water Management Authority. So first of all, we should know that when Kaveri Water Management Authority came into existence, so the Supreme Court had in its 2018 verdict asked the center to constitute this Kaveri Water Management Authority to address the dispute of sharing of river water between Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Kerala and Puducherry. So this was after the 2018 Supreme Court's directive, that the center had constituted CWMA. The second thing we must know about this is the composition. So it will have one chairman, it will have 8 members, and it will have one secretary. So this is a major composition, and then we should know its functions. What is it going to do? The first thing it's going to do is the Supreme Court has given a directive. So the job of CWMA would be to ensure that this directive is complied with. So it will secure the compliance and implementation of the Supreme Court order related to the regulation and control of Kaveri waters. So implementation of the Supreme Court order, that's the first thing that it's going to do. The second is it will also regulate the water releases. So it will regulate the water releases by the state government. So here Karnataka has to release water to Tamil Nadu. So it's going to see and ensure the regulation of water release by Karnataka. The third thing is what it will also do is it will advise the state governments. Apart from the release of waters timely according to what has been mentioned, it's also important for the state governments to adopt some those practices which can improve the water use efficiency and reduce the demand for the water from the demand side, because supply is going to be constrained even in the future. So what we can do is by better management of the demand. So that is where the CWMA will be advising the state governments. For example, it will advise the governments on suitable measures they can take to improve the water use efficiency. Like for example, by adopting micro irrigation, which like drip irrigation and sprinkler irrigation. Then what can be the changes in the cropping pattern to ensure that there is less demand for water, improved agronomic practices, command area development. So these are some of the things in which the CWMA will be advising the state governments. And also it is going to make an annual report about all the activities of the authority in the preceding year. And the body will also have senior and eminent engineers who have experience of water resource management. So it's going to include several specialists and not just the bureaucrats. So it will also bring their specialist experience and guidance, and this expertise will help in better management of the water and better implementation of the Supreme Court guidelines. So basically it is going to help with the distress sharing formula. So this is the role of Kaveri Water Management Authority. We will now move to the next topic, which is virtual diplomacy. This is also called as the online diplomacy or the digital diplomacy. So where the states will had to meet in the past weeks, and several summits had to take place. Because of the COVID crisis, they have not been able to meet physically, but nevertheless these summits have taken place virtually. For example, India took the leadership to have a virtual SAARC summit, and now there is a NAM summit virtual that took place. Even the G20 met virtually, the UNSC met virtually. So even in India, as far as India is concerned, the foreign embassies which are in Delhi are also being engaged through video conferences. So Raja Mohan, who is a foreign international relation expert, he says that much of the energy of the Ministry of External Affairs actually goes into organizing various visits. But now that because of the crisis, things are happening through the video conferencing and the virtual platform, it doesn't take much of their time in organizing the visits. So when much of the time is not consumed in organizing visits, there will be time left to follow up on what has been decided on each of these summits. So now, because the MEA was spent a lot of time in organizing visits, it was very poor with follow-up of what all was decided in the summits. So this actually made the whole summit rather useless, because many things were decided in the summit, but then nobody even followed it up. So now the virtual diplomacy makes high-level engagement also much less burdensome and much less cumbersome. So that is the importance of virtual diplomacy. So this is another angle in the diplomacy that has come because of the corona crisis. There was another article on privacy concern with respect to the Arogya Setu app. So we have already covered that in detail on 29th April. On 13th April, we have covered privacy versus public health. And on 22nd April, we have covered the right to privacy, and under that we have covered data protection in detail. So that part has already been covered, so I am not taking up today. You may go to those videos and prefer them for better and holistic coverage. So now we will deal with the question that I had asked yesterday. The question was about discuss the reasons for the rising man-animal conflict. So first of all, you have to quote some statistics like why there is a rise in the man-animal conflict, and then we will come to the reasons for the increase in the man-animal conflict. And whenever you are quoting the reasons, also try to give at least one example for, if not each of the reason, at least for one in two reasons. Try to give an example for whatever reason you are writing. For example, first reason is the human population growth. So definitely there is a population growth and expansion. So humanity is coming in close proximity to the wild species. So here you can give the example of the leopards. How leopards have been coming in contact and black bear has been coming in contact in those villages nearby. So this has happened in many cases in Karnataka, where the leopards have come to the urban habitats. So they are attracted by the garbage because there is a huge amount of garbage, because of which the pigs are attracted, and the leopards want to come because there are a lot of pigs. So this is the reason, and also the settlements are very close to the forest areas. So that is why, because of human population expansion, this example you can give. Second is there has been habitat degradation and there is habitat fragmentation. So here you can give the example of an animal like a tiger. A tiger, for instance, one male tiger will need an area of 60 to 100 square kilometer. But if you take the example of the Bor Tiger Reserve in Maharashtra, the entire area of the tiger reserve itself is 138 square kilometer. So this means that it will barely have one or two tigers. And that is why this has led to, because of the fragmentation, it has led to isolation of the population, and this will further give rise to more complications. So all of these issues are related to this. So you can also again give the example of elephants. Elephants also, in fact, elephants travel nearly 10 to 20 kilometers a day. But then because of the fragmentation, a herd is getting restricted to smaller areas. So they are bound to move out in search of food and water. So that is why for those animals like elephants which travel long distances, most of the areas to which they have traveled, they usually fall outside of the protected areas. So they are bound to come in conflict. Then you can also quote the problems of prey, because the prey-based species are reducing. So that is why these wild animals are coming in contact with the human settlements so as to find prey. So that is why it is very important to ensure that there is enough prey-based species and there is enough fodder for the animals to thrive on. For example, in tiger reserves, the number of deer species had reduced because of killing of the deer and shooting. So because of which the deer population fell, and deer is a very important prey base for the tigers, due to which the tigers started starving and they also started dying, and in some cases tigers started coming in contact with the human population, venturing for prey. So the prey issue is there. And then also sometimes it is also because of the rising numbers. So our protection and conservation efforts have paid fruit, and some numbers of some animals have increased disproportionately. For instance, the population of monkeys, it has multiplied much more, and therefore they are coming in contact with the human habitats. For example, the rhesus macaque. So it has to usually spend nearly 10 to 14 hours in search of food. But then now we can find them very close to the human settlements, because in close to the human settlements they can find food within 10 minutes. So therefore they will come because their numbers is also huge. Conservation efforts have been huge. So that is why they are coming in contact. So next you can talk about the land use transformation. There is a change in the way we are using the land. So all the wildlife habitat, the wetlands, they are being encroached upon. There is expansion of agricultural activities. There is expansion of the urban areas. So this transformation in the way land is used has also brought the animals in contact with humans. Next, you can talk about the infrastructure development. So because of some relaxations in the norms for widening of railway networks, highways, these protected areas have now been shrinking and all that. Then again, you can talk about the poisoning poaching and all that. So animals are driven away from their natural habitat, and they are forced to take shelter in the human habitats. So they are, because of poaching and all, animals are scared and they are driven out of their natural habitat. So this again will make them to come in contact with humans. Then again you can say that there is also various human practices like agriculture or even grazing. If you take the example of grazing, the pasture lands, wetlands are becoming are getting degraded. So due to which grazing takes place now at places which are very close to the protected areas. So these practices have also brought the animals close to us. So even if it is not asked in the question, even if it is a 10-marker question, as part of the conclusion, you have to write something about the way forward that can be done. So for example, several wildlife experts say that we have to move from the area-based protection, that is protected areas which are protected, to an ecosystem-based approach where the entire ecosystem is protected. We also need to increase the corridors for tigers and elephants. We need to build some eco bridges. So this ecosystem based approach is also being provided for in the national new wildlife policy also. So that is needed, and we also need to improve the community participation, because that is when any conservation effort will be successful. We can also improve the early warning system so that we can manage such crisis. And also we need to improve the prey-based animals. So on that we need to work on the conservation of the prey-based species like deer and all that. For the time being, we can also incorporate some crop insurance measures in the case of in event of destruction by the wild animals, like we saw yesterday where the elephants had raided the fields near the Kaundinya Wildlife Sanctuary. So these things are there. So with all these things, you can conclude your answer. So this will take you at maximum 3 to 4 lines, which you can write as part of the conclusion and conclude your answer. So with this, we'll come to today's question, which is again derived from today's answer itself, that states have been demanding allowing shooting of the vermin animals. So you have to discuss the ethical issues involved in shooting of vermins. This is a 10-marker question for 150 words. Do frame a mental map of the question. At least now you can do it, because prelims is postponed, and you can take out some time every day to keep tab of the current affairs and at least make a mental chart of the answers, so that you don't lose touch with all these. So that's it for today. Thank you.